Hey everyone, on today's episode, we've got Thomas Maurer from the Azure Advocacy team at Microsoft. We're going to talk about Azure, Azure Stack HCI, Azure Stack Hub, all things Azure and Azure Stack and hybrid cloud coming up on today's episode of the DOJO podcast. Well, everyone, welcome back to the next episode of the DOJO podcast, the podcast designed to help you become the IT black belt within your organization. I'm your host, Andy Serwich with Hornet Security, and, as always, we've got a co-host on for today's episode, good friend of mine, Thomas Maurer. How's it going, Thomas?
Doing great. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, definitely. It's good to have you on the show. I've been really excited about this episode because, we'll get into this a little bit, but, for those that aren't aware, Thomas is actually part of the Azure Advocacy team at Microsoft. So, he's always a wealth of information whenever we talk to him. So really excited to have you here today, Thomas. So I guess in terms of introductions, for those that may not know who you are, can you kind of explain, first introduce yourself, and then kind of explain what you do as part of the Azure Advocacy team at Microsoft?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Thomas Maurer. As Andy pointed out, I'm a Azure Cloud Advocate. I joined Microsoft 2.5 years ago. Before that, I was actually working as a cloud architect for a Microsoft partner. We did interesting projects around back in the days with Hyper-V and System Center, and then obviously moved to things like Azure Stack and Azure-related projects and bring all that hybrid cloud stuff to work. That is also where I am now technology-wise. I work a lot with our hybrid cloud technologies, and we will probably talk about that a little bit later, but obviously big fan of Azure Arc, Windows Server, the Azure Stack portfolio, and many other of our products and services. And yeah, it's super interesting to actually tell what a cloud advocate does, right? So
right.
It sounds very like when I usually talk to people, they think it's probably like a sales or a marketing job in that sense. But actually, we are really part of the Azure engineering team itself, right? It's a role within engineering. And what we do on a very high level is we're actually doing two major parts, right? One is really creating and delivering content. And that can mean very different things. This can mean from video, blog post, documentation, Learn modules, like in Microsoft Learn, but then also presentations. Like if we create presentations for our customers or help them with like delivering like a session on that, or also joining obviously like events like Microsoft Ignite the Tour, Build, and a lot of other of this stuff, and obviously third parties as well. Joining podcasts like this one is also one of my favorite tasks to do, obviously. And then the other big part is when we have these conversations with our customers out there, we always learn a lot, right? We try to listen very, very carefully, like what is working, what is not working, and then bring that feedback back to our engineering teams and program managers, so they can actually then go out and address these. And in some cases, it's also things we can address. Like, for example, if the customer tells us, look, there's no documentation for this specific thing, or I found this, it's probably outdated, or how can I do this? And we can then go out and fix the documentation, or we can go and, for example, write a quick tool, for example, to work on that. And so these are different things we are doing.
That's a lot. You guys got a lot on your plate, definitely. And Thomas, correct me if I'm wrong. I guess in my mind, I most equate you and your team with what used to be known as technical evangelism at Microsoft. And I think what the big difference now, from then to now, is that team was technically part of marketing, whereas you mentioned you guys are part of the engineering team. So, I mean, just logistically, there's a big difference there in that, if you get a piece of feedback or you run into a bug or there's an interesting use case, you can go directly talk to your engineering team, whereas, somebody who's part of marketing has a little bit more difficult job with that, right?
Exactly. That is definitely makes the way we need to go way shorter, right? And obviously also in terms of like when you're working in marketing, it's probably you need to have other goals, right? As
Right.
well. Like our one of our goals is really like help first. And actually, we are in this comfortable position where our goal is really to help customers be successful with our products. I know this sounds now very like, okay, this is like our standard sentences, but it is really about that, right?
Right.
So when customers are reaching out or they're looking for a solution for the problem, that is where we try to help. And with having these short organizational parts actually to actually go out and reach to a program manager is super easy for that. And we also tend to be technical in a way that we not obviously just regularly maybe not just focus on one specific feature within our services or products,
Right.
but then have a couple of them and look at it more from a customer perspective. So I always say like we are advocates for Microsoft, but we also advocates for our customers within Microsoft, right?
Right.
So if you tell me, hey, this is, for example, something I wish you like Microsoft would improve, I can definitely take that feedback back, right? I cannot guarantee that we can fix it, but I can
Right.
definitely bring that back, and that is definitely one of the advantages now. What we're doing here.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's exciting to see how that team has grown and evolved over the last couple of years, and I kind of have to chuckle a little bit because you say, oh, all of us on this team, we tend to be technical, and I'm thinking tend to be technical. I'm like, I look at you and all the people that are on your team. I'm like, there's a lot of brain power on that team, So,
so why I said this, like sometimes I'm a little bit like, obviously when you work in a company like Microsoft or also other companies, right? You have these deep focused people on one specific feature, for example. And I always compare when it comes to a technical dev, I always often compare to like our feature PMs or our engineers, which do really deep technical work on one thing. Now, obviously, like often or many of us, we're not just covering one thing, we're covering multiple things.
right.
And we try to bring that all together. Which also obviously is still technical, absolutely. I really hope we are, but it's not like, again, when I compare myself to like really a deep down person in one specific field, when you're just focusing on one thing, it's obviously you can go way deeper than like when we look at the whole customer scenario.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you guys are more 10,000 foot view, kind of a larger view of the entire puzzle, whereas like you said, a PM is maybe working on a specific puzzle piece, right? So that's that makes sense.
Yeah. And again, I cannot like speak for every advocate, right? We have like advocates which are focusing on a technology which like is really like one service, for example, and then it's obviously like also a different story. I don't like about that, but we are more like if we look at the team, like the specific team I'm in, we're really looking at the IT pro audience, right? We want to speak to the IT pros, which I know didn't get a lot of love in the past from Microsoft, and that we really try to change that and bring that back. And so you've been in the industry and there's a ton of things you need to do as an IT pro, right?
Yeah.
It can be you do so many different things, like countless things, and so that is where we try to like figure out, okay, what different roles are there and what different types of people and how can we help them with these specific things.
It's funny you mentioned that. Yeah, IT pros doing so many different things. I was actually telling a joke. I was speaking truth, but I formulated it as a joke to my 12-year-old in the car the other day. I was saying, when you're doing IT, when you're in the trenches, supporting a place, like if it plugs into the wall, they think you support it. You know what I mean? I'm like, I'm sorry, Bob from accounting. I can install your finance application. I can't tell you how to use it, though. Anyway, well, yeah, I appreciate the kind of introduction to your team. I know there's a lot of people out there that consume a lot of the content that you guys make. It's fantastic stuff. I'll be sure to include a couple of links to some of the stuff that you guys do, including your blog, Thomas, in the show notes under this video. Or if you're listening to this on iTunes or some audio only version, I'll make sure it gets into the show notes. That way you guys can check it out later. So Well, Thomas, you mentioned earlier that you kind of focus on the hybrid cloud story, the hybrid cloud part of the equation, right? And I think, like you mentioned, I think that's an area that a lot of IT pros are finding themselves in these days. Is that, hey, they still have some stuff on-prem, but there's benefits, and I feel like a lot of IT pros are finally getting over that trust issue with the public cloud, right? So I've seen a lot of adoption myself of cloud services over the last 3 to 5 years now. So that's kind of what I want to focus on for the bulk of our talk today, is kind of that hybrid cloud story. And I guess you kind of alluded to it a little bit already. Hybrid cloud is really a huge focus for Microsoft, right? I mean, you've got things like Windows Server 2022 with all of its various Azure hooks and tie-ins. You've got Azure Stack HCI, Azure Arc. Windows Admin Center has allowed a lot of Azure tie-ins and integrations. I mean, that's really kind of a key focus for you guys right now, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, what you just said is true, right? And I think the whole hybrid cloud stuff is really like, it just becomes the new normal of doing IT for many companies out there, right? And I also, like, by talking to a lot of the IT pros, some of them really, like, for years already wanted to use the cloud, right? But they were probably not allowed by their company policies, right, or compliance reasons. They were just like, legal was not allowing them to use it. Because what the cloud can do, it's obviously not that you just need to move everything to the cloud. I mean, there are certain benefits you get from moving stuff to the cloud, but it's also about using the cloud for the things you're running on-prem. And that is something we, for example, doing with Windows Server as well. Like Windows Server, when it comes, runs perfectly in your own environment, but it also runs perfectly in Azure. But what we're also doing is try to use Azure to actually make your on-premises environment better, right?
Right.
It's not just like, okay, you need to, like, to get all the to get a benefit, you need to move everything to the cloud. No. We understand that there are reasons why you probably cannot move everything to the cloud, right? Or you, like, in some cases you don't even want to, but there are reasons like networking reasons or data sovereignty reasons and so on,
right?
Which don't allow you to do this. And so that is absolutely like where we try to position ourselves, because hybrid is really going to be an end state for most of our customers, right? It's not just going to be an in-between state until everything is moved to the cloud. A lot of our customers will actually be in a hybrid end state.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I think the most common scenario that I've kind of run into is that people will move the low-hanging fruit into the cloud, right? And then they'll keep their sensitive stuff on-prem. So, like, for example, web servers. People love to move web servers up into the cloud because it makes a lot of sense, right? Mail servers. I personally, email is one of the things that I hated managing the most when I was in the trenches. So when, 365 became a big thing, well, I switched, my organization, we switched over to it when it was still called BPAWS way back in the day. I'm dating myself a little bit there, but but like services like email, like, you guys take them. I don't want to manage it anymore. Like, I couldn't get rid of my Exchange server fast enough. You know what I mean? So I think a lot of people end up moving that. And then the stuff that stays on-prem that I've seen is typically, like you said, anything that centers around data sovereignty, or I've done a lot of work for manufacturing organizations over the years, and you'll have a lot of situations where you've got like a manufacturing line that is doing like, 10,000 SQL writes a minute or something crazy like that, and it latency wise, it just doesn't work to have that database live in the cloud, right? So those are some of the more common situations that I've run into. That's probably what you guys see as well, I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm happy you brought this example up, right? Because one of the things I recently talked to a customer, they are having factories all over the place, and they probably, I don't know if like latency would be an issue. I mean, we have definitely there are things where latency would be an issue, or like right. you run so many data, you get to gather so many data out of these factory lines. That's definitely one point. But the other point, like I talked with the customer, was, okay, look, in some cases, this factory is really out in the woods somewhere,
Right.
Basically, and we don't get a super super available internet connectivity there. We get internet connectivity, but we cannot afford that the factory stops working when we don't have internet connectivity, right? And so
Right.
in that sense, it's also like something where they say, okay, so first of all, like latency stuff and for the applications, it's great to have that there and gather all that data there. Also for availability, and then they still can take they still upload that data later on to the cloud to then actually do some machine learning on it or run some queries or just store it for later on.
Right.
But yeah, and so there are tons of these examples out there, not just when it comes, for example, to IoT, but there is as you know, there's so many Windows Server applications out there.
Yes.
Which it can be in stores, right? Point of sale systems, stuff like that. I've seen many of these things, and so you need to provide them with solutions. And we really think it's not just we think it's an important part. It's really for our customers, it really is important, right?
Yep, definitely. And that kind of gets into the part of a little bit of the next the next topic I kind of want to talk about a little bit is just. We've talked about all these different use cases, right? These different scenarios and examples of hybrid cloud. And this is where I think Microsoft really shines over all of your competitors in that you provide so many different options. There's so many different options for providing these services. So just at a real high level, I mean, we've got public Azure, right? We've got Azure Stack. We've got Azure Stack HCI as well. Can you kind of... I don't know, maybe do a quick rundown of each one of those, because a lot of the folks that I talk to, not so much on the public Azure side, but I do know there's some confusion around Azure Stack and Azure Stack HCI. I know that branding that branding change, it makes sense to me. I know why you guys are doing it, but to some of the customers that I talk to on a regular basis, they're like, it's confusing. Why is that? Can you kind of run through the kind of the labeling between the three there?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, let me say you're absolutely right. Again, this is also very important to me that I mentioned this is we're not just offering one product which does hybrid, right?
Yep.
We're not just going out there and saying this is hybrid and every customer needs to do it that way. Everything else is not the way of doing it. We really have a huge portfolio of hybrid products, and the Azure Stack portfolio, as I call it now, is one of them, right? It really. When you think about Azure Stack, it's now really not just a single product or service anymore. It's now really a family of products.
Right.
It was, as you were saying, it was we started with Azure Stack, and if I remember, I think the first announcement was at Microsoft Ignite in Chicago in 2015. I think, if I remember that.
Yeah, I remember that.
Good times.
Yep.
But that was then the original Azure Stack, right? And that was really a kind of like an appliance which allowed customers to run a small Azure environment within their own data center or location, right? So, for example, you got your own Azure portal, you get the Azure Resource Manager, your own instance of it, and you can then run really that in your data center. Now, what we realized is that to provide this actually needs to be kind of like an appliance approach, right? So you were able to get from different OEMs, but it was actually a closed appliance delivered. It would, in the background, it would still run Windows, or it does still run Windows Server, but you never would really touch that, right? You would just go into, you have an admin portal, you have the customer portal, the tenant portal, as we called it, and it allowed really customers to go out and have that Azure experiences on places where you don't have Azure. Now, this is obviously great, but there were also other things which customer wanted. One of them was, back in the days, it was called DataBox Edge. And that is a first-party appliance, and it's now called Azure Stack Edge. And this is really designed with high-performance storage. So this is exactly something where you could go into a factory. You have this high-performance storage. You send all that IoT data to that appliance, and then you run machine learning and AI on that appliance. And then later on, you could even send that data back to Azure, right? That's the other part. Azure Stack, the original Azure Stack, was then renamed to Azure Stack Hub. So that's the new name of that.
Yep.
And it focuses more or less on these really like disconnected scenarios, right? And really places where you can really not use the Azure as a control plane. That is like where you need your own instance of Azure Resource Manager and all that. This is really a great place there to be. And we knew that our newest kit on the block is Azure Stack HCI, which stands for Hyperconverged Infrastructure. And that is basically coming back from running Windows Server hyperconverged, like with storage spaces direct and all that good stuff, but actually bringing it down to say, hey, okay, this is now a SKU which is completely focused on doing hyperconverged, and it brings a lot of benefits with it by connecting it through Azure. So it's delivered as an Azure service. So it's designed to run like from very different environments. And you can build it yourself. You just need to have validated hardware.
Right.
You can start with 2 nodes. You can go all the way up to 16, high performance, high capacity systems if you needed to. But we also have very small setups where, for example, they fit into a backpack, for example.
Right.
You get a high available cluster in your backpack.
I think they demoed that at a recent Ignite too, if I remember right. It was like Azure Stack and in a backpack. I remember seeing that.
Yep, exactly. And again, you can then go out and you can do virtualization on this. And then once you have that infrastructure platform, you can then run also some advanced things on it. And so before I move what you can run on it, because that becomes even more interesting, but is that it's it can be managed out of Azure. You can also manage it on-prem, because we don't want to create that dependency on your internet connectivity. But you would actually get, like, if you manage multiple of these things, you get a fleet overview in Azure. You can use monitoring in Azure. You can do like some update management from there. And a couple of other cool stuff which we announced. And some of them are in preview, some of them are just coming around the corner. Now, Azure Stack HCI, again, great solution if you do virtualization for your servers, for VDI and all that. But our customers obviously today want more, right? They want to have some of their past services, for example, we have in Azure, which, for example, Azure Stack Hub, a couple of them brings down to your Azure environment. They want to run there in their own data center. They want to run, for example, Kubernetes in their own data center.
Right.
And so we have, on top of this, you could, for example, run what we call AKS, like the Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So this brings down the Kubernetes service we have in Azure, and you can run that service on an Azure Stack HCI, as it would look like then like an Azure service, right?
Right.
And on top of that, you can then deploy Arc-enabled services. And I know we're going to probably talk about Arc way more today.
That'll come up next.
This will then allow us basically to give an infrastructure for our Arc-enabled services. So that means you can, for example, run an Azure SQL outside of Azure and many other things. So this is some really cool stuff we're doing there. So to quick answer your question, we have Azure Stack Hub for your disconnected environments where you get your own instance of Azure Resource Manager and an Azure portal. We have Azure Stack Edge, which allows you to run machine learning and AI at the edge as a first-party appliance. And then a third, we have Azure Stack HCI, which is our hyperconverged infrastructure, which again gives you a lot of flexibility on what you want to run in on top of.
And again, we come back to options, all kinds of options for whatever use case. And so that's a really good summary, and there's a lot you can do there. And I think for me, again, being historically, not so much anymore, but historically I was always a Hyper-V, a storage, and a networking guy. That was my thing for 15, 20 years in my career, you know? So to me, Azure Stack HCI is what feels most familiar, because, you know, I've got my storage fabric I need to think about. Well, it's, you know, the fabric between the hyperconverged nodes, you know, I got to think about that. So it's most akin to what we've been doing with Windows Server all these years. And I think what's really interesting really interesting for me is that basically I can present my own data center, my own cluster as kind of an Azure region, correct? It kind of appears as almost like its own region in Azure, not officially a region, but you see it as a resource that you can provision to and utilize. And I think that's kind of where Arc comes in, correct?
Yep, you're absolutely going here in the right direction. We call that custom locations, and this is something we need for Azure Arc, right? So our customers told us, well, and this is just one part of Azure Arc, by the way. This is the Arc-enabled services part.
Right.
So customers told us that, like, look, we love, for example, let's take an example, Azure SQL. Like, we love Azure SQL. It's a SQL database as a service, if you want to. We really like it in Azure. But we have a scenario where we can't use it in Azure. Like, let's go back to the factory scenario, right? We want to build an application using Azure SQL, but we don't want to have that dependency to the internet connectivity. So we want to be able to run that in our local data center. And that is where Azure Arc comes in and says, hey, if you can't use an Azure Arc, if you can't use an Azure service in Azure, we bring the Azure service to you. And so we allow customers basically to run Azure Arc, Azure SQL managed instances in their own data center. That's one of the first services we have announced, and I think that is currently GA. We also have other services announced, like app services with web apps, logic apps, and all that stuff. And this really then gives us the possibility to run these services. Now, when you have these platforms now, like let's say we have now this Azure SQL, right? Or we have web apps, for example. You want to deploy that in a way that you actually deploy that on your environment. And that is where the custom location comes in. So we can register, for example, a Kubernetes cluster as a custom location. So that Kubernetes cluster could run in your own data center. It could run at another cloud provider. And then it shows up in the Azure portal as when you select the region, it will show up as a custom region or a custom location, sorry. So when you deploy a new web app, when you select where to deploy, you see all the Azure regions, but then you also see your custom locations. And then you can select, okay, I want to deploy that web app to my Kubernetes cluster, for example, running here underneath my desk. So that is, I think, a pretty cool scenario.
That's an amazing scenario, if you ask me, because I mean, this is like the magical world I've been trying to find for the last 10 years, right? And that I have a unified management plane for managing my workloads wherever they live, whether it's on-prem, whether it's in the clouds. I mean, to me, when I think Azure Arc was announced, 2 years ago now, if I remember correctly, something like that. I forget exactly when.
It was in 2019. I think it was in 2019 at Microsoft Ignite in Orlando back then. I think it was the last Ignite, which was still in person.
Yeah.
Before we had all this coming up.
I'm dying for an in-person conference, I just have to say. But anyway, yeah, I remember when I seeing Azure Arc, it was like that was my highlight of Ignite that year, was just, that unified management. And then, like you've mentioned, also integrating some of those more Azure platform services. Like SQL is the perfect example. People love standing up a database, consuming the database without having to manage the plumbing, right? I mean, because again, putting my IT pro hat back on, any time I needed the database, like, I'm just like, just give me the database. I don't want to manage the OS. I don't want to worry about patching another server and maintaining another server. That was just like the perfect first platform service to go onto Azure Arc and Azure Stack HCI. So I was really happy to see that. And the AKS on Azure Arc, it's on my list of things over here to tinker with and set up and use, but I just haven't gotten around to it yet. There's too much great technology to play with, so it's
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I agree. Look, like a lot of people are probably still out there and thinking, hey, well, if I'm the guy who's now managing the SQL servers and this goes away, what do I do, right? But trust me, there's a lot of stuff still which you need to do. Not just like when it comes to SQL Server, but like setting this whole thing up is not. It enables you to do more, right? There's not less work, I always say. There's like just like you can spend your time on other stuff to provide more value to your organization. And I mean, one thing which happens now with Azure Arc is, and there are a couple of things I want to mention as well. So when we look at Azure Arc, I spoke now about how we can deliver like Azure services to customer environments. And that usually, like in many cases for right now, for example, for Azure SQL or app services, this needs a Kubernetes cluster. This can run on Azure Stack HCI, but it doesn't have to. So it's modular, right? So you could, even if you have a Kubernetes cluster running, for example, on VMware, or a Kubernetes cluster running even at another cloud provider, you could then go out and use that and deploy on top of that, deploy Azure services. So that is one of the cool things I want to mention. And the other thing you brought up is actually like that control plane, right? It's not just to bring Azure services down, but also connect existing stuff, like, for example, like your Windows servers or your classic SQL servers, for example.
Right.
You can connect these up, or your Kubernetes clusters as well, connect these up and get the advantage of the control plane. So that is what we call the Azure Arc enabled infrastructure, where we then provide you, like, for example, if you look at all the management capabilities we have for Azure VMs, let's say log analytics, monitoring, update management, policies, security center, and the list goes on.
Right.
We can enable that not just for VMs running in Azure, but also for servers running outside of Azure. And so really cool stuff going on there in that space, definitely.
Yeah, I remember seeing that too. And that was like a mind-blowing moment. It's like, wait, I can have Windows Server running in AWS and I can manage it through Azure Arc. I mean, it's cool times, because I think you guys have kind of, you've acknowledged that while you would love people to use Azure, obviously, and I think it's the best public cloud service out there, but I think you also, guys, you acknowledge that, hey, some organizations are going to be multi-cloud, right? And whether that's because of, technical needs or company policy or whatever, I think it's great that you guys are allowing people to manage their Windows resources regardless of where they're at. I think that's a huge deal. So,
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Kind of looking at my list here. We've talked about a lot of stuff so far. We've talked about, kind of where Azure Arc fits, how your data center kind of becomes what you said, a custom location, right? I guess one thing that I kind of want to wrap up with a little bit here is, we've talked about all this stuff, right? I've said that a couple of times during this episode. We've talked about all this stuff. What would be your general advice, looking at public Azure, Azure Stack Hub, and Azure Stack HCI? What would be your general advice if I'm a new IT pro? Which one should I use and where? Right? I know it's a real general question, but just speaking in generalities, where do you see the real target for each one of these?
Yeah. So what I would do, like, if you know you need to be like in a hybrid environment, like if you know, okay, look, there are certain stuff which can't go to the cloud. What I would definitely do, I mean, besides all the assessments you need to do, which data it is and what can go to cloud and what not, I would really try to start building use cases and see what actually needs to run and what do we need to have, right? And from there on, we can then decide what that looks like. So in many cases, you'll probably end up in a case where you said, hey, I can use both. I can use Azure, I can use the control plane, but I need to have some stuff which I can on-prem, that when internet connectivity goes away or something, or data sovereignty stuff, that stuff needs to stay in there. And so I would recommend, technology-wise, definitely look at the Azure Arc piece, because that is really something which is like, doesn't matter which hypervisor you're using, right? More or less. It doesn't matter if you're a Microsoft shop or if you're having some other vendors in there. That will really help you to understand, okay, how do I get this stuff connected in Azure and manage that? And also the other way, how do I get Azure to places where not? On the Azure Stack side, I would say, unless I have very specific use cases, like I mentioned, like the AI stuff, or for example, where I need an own control, like an Azure Resource Manager, I would really look at like Azure Stack HCI as one of the the solution if you need infrastructure in your environment. Again, there are cases where, for example, when we speak about these factory floors, if you have IoT data and like a ton of that stuff, and you want to run machine learning on it, for example, Azure Stack HCI would be a really great fit for this, right? Sorry, Azure Stack Edge, I wanted to say. I'm not sure if I said that.
Gotcha.
but,
Gotcha.
Perfect. But in many cases, you probably end up in a way where you run different stuff, and then Azure Stack HCI is really a good place to go, and then combine it with Azure Arc together, right? Again, but I recommend before looking at the technologies, look at what you actually need or want to do. That is something I see with many customers out there, is that they're not building their use cases, right? I go in there and tell them all the great stuff we can do. But at the end, as you mentioned, there's so many different tools we have available to help our customers that, like, where do I start now, right? So it's important for them to actually know what do we want to do. And then we can find the right technology to look at.
Yeah, that makes all kinds of sense because, I think as part of those discussions of figuring out what they want to do, obviously you're going to have leadership enter that discussion, and there's going to be, we mentioned it a few times, those data sovereignty rules are going to come into play, and those company policies are going to come into play. You got to take all that information and, okay, which solution makes the most sense now, right? So that's fantastic advice. I guess to kind of wrap up our show for today, for somebody who's new to some of these technologies, where would you recommend they look for, some resources to get started? I know you have an amazing blog. We've got some Azure and Azure Stack HCI related content out on the Altero blogs as well. I'll be sure to link both of those locations. Are there any other spots you would recommend, Thomas? I'm guessing Docs probably would be the top recommendation, I'm sure.
Yeah, so definitely Microsoft Docs if you're looking for some specific information to a certain product or service. I also recommend that you definitely check out Microsoft Learn. Microsoft Learn is our free learning platform where you can just basically log in. You don't even need an Azure subscription or any of that. And it's not just for Azure, it's also for a lot of other Microsoft technologies. And it provides you with like some guided experience where you can read through. Sometimes you have videos, you have some quiz to do to like figure out if it worked. But the great thing is, if in some cases you get these free sandboxes. So even though you don't have an Azure subscription, you don't need to register with a credit card or anything. You can spin up a sandbox, and we will provide you with an Azure environment for I think a couple of hours a day.
Nice.
And you get guided through, and you can actually deploy stuff and try things out. So it's a really great experience to learn about different things. That is one thing. And then for those who are looking at how do I adopt cloud, how is that going? How do I migrate? How do I build governance for my environment? How do I do all these parts, but also not just the technology-wise, but also organizational parts, processes, and things like that? I highly recommend to have a look at the Cloud Adoption Framework, which really has all that proven guidance we created over the years and all these best practices in there. And so that is something I would definitely have a look at and go through and see what makes sense there. There is also some, especially because we talked now about hybrid, there is one which is like a Cloud Adoption Framework part, which talks about different scenarios. And one of them is about hybrid. And it goes through like the things we just talked about here. For example, about the control plane, how important it is to have a control plane over all your hybrid environments. It talks about like how to adopt this, what is the right technologies. It explains the differences between the different services and stuff like that. So that is definitely a good place to go as well.
Yeah, sounds like there's lots of content out there. Definitely, for those of you that are interested, again, I'll make sure we get all those resources collected into the show notes. That way you guys can get some easy access to those. And then finally, Thomas, if people have follow-up questions or they want to connect with you after watching the episode, how can they best get a hold of you?
I think the best way is go to thomasmaurer.ch. There is obviously a lot of content out there. You have also a contact form, or you can follow me on Twitter with Thomas Maurer. Or you can also add me on LinkedIn if you're there as well.
That sounds good. Well, hey, Thomas, appreciate you taking the time out of your day. I know you're a busy guy. It's always great to talk to you. So we'll have to, all this talk of Azure Arc, we'll have to have you on for an Azure Arc webinar or something along those lines at some point, because it's, I think that's something that's really game changing. I think a lot of people are interested in it. So we'll have to talk about that at some point. So we'll have to keep that in mind. And then for those of you listening and or watching, really appreciate you checking out the podcast. We've also got a bunch of great content out in the Altero dojos. We talk about Hyper-V, VMware, service providers, backup and DR, Azure, M365. These days, it's getting easier to say what we don't blog about than what we do. So there's tons of great content. You can go to www.altero.com/dojo and then pick your poison from there. We got all kinds of different categories. So be sure to check that out. Other than that, appreciate you stopping by and watching today's episode of the Dojo Podcast, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, it's Andy again. Hey, thanks for watching the episode today. Hope you enjoyed it. One thing I wanted to leave you with, we've been talking a lot about Azure Stack HCI, Hyper-V, hybrid cloud, and a lot of the recent episodes. Wanted to let you know that on March 23rd, we are running a webinar that talks about all things Azure Stack HCI and hybrid cloud. Now, you can register for that webinar by clicking on the link in the description of this episode. And if you're watching or listening to this episode after March 23rd, you can use that same link to watch the webinar on demand. So hope you enjoy it. Again, we hope to see you for a future episode of the podcast. Have a great day.